One of the main reasons that I was able to keep going with the consulting was that I was finally able to honestly discuss the frustrations of not having a car with people who seemed to actively be working with people who lacked personal vehicles. The black consultant from ATX Walk Bike Roll suggested that I also participate in the Project Connect community engagement program as a community connector, which would mean more reports and more weekends, but was completely doable as long as I had access to bus service. I applied in January. She interviewed me in February when I was heavily depressed, but I was able to convey both enthusiasm and competence, which are the most common habits for black women in professional fields. The meetings would start in March, which meant that I would be paid by another contract, but not in enough time to potentially secure an apartment. Likely, I would have just enough to continue feeding myself with all the bills being paid. Developers have indoctrinated everyone into believing that building more means that prices would automatically come down, and the unfortunate truth is that a lot of people working for public transportation entities believe the same thing. The first train line in Austin was centered around most of the stops being park and rides, but there was generally nothing to any of the stops except parking. It was dangerous to be at the stops late at night because nobody and nothing was there, but developers kept saying that proximity to transportation justified high prices because they were only building for people who insisted on maintaining private vehicles, defeating the whole purpose of transit oriented development. Consequently, Austin already had multiple projects based on poorly planned sites that no one in their right mind would consider transit friendly. After all, the assumption within the Texas urban planning scene is that people will eventually get cars, so there is no need to plan as if people lack personal vehicles. It is exceptionally difficult debating that property values are not determined by construction and that everyone is not itching to add car payments to their monthly bill rosters, especially when discussing such matters with financially comfortable people who all have vehicles. There were several Metro colleagues who kept parroting that the city just needed to invest in more development, no matter how many times I indicated that rent had risen because developers were only building luxury properties. None of these people had made under $40,000 in years, and explaining that not everyone could afford to pay $1,500 a month in rent just to have transit was like pulling teeth. Even when I pointed out that developers only included minimal median family income apartments to qualify for incentives, people kept claiming that more development was needed. I was reminded of my favorite line from the Harrison Ford Julia Ormond remake of Sabrina. More isn't always better, Linus. Sometimes it's just more. During the first community engagement event, I went to a microbrewery off North Lamar, and once I got there, I recognized that it was the perfect example of ridiculous urban planning that has nothing to do with transit. Half the site has no shade, and the businesses are about zero point 0.1 miles away from the stop itself, while most of the apartment living and housing is wildly expensive and requires people to make at least $45,000 per year just to qualify. Furthermore, the site was kitschy, meaning that it was supposed to be fun but not particularly functional. Since then, there has been a cultural shift to be more accommodating to Asian populations, but initially, there was no reason for anyone to be there except to go drinking. This is a very bad habit of a lot of community groups in Austin. Assume that everyone wants to spend time drinking excessively while facetiously discussing the issues they are paid to discuss. Poor people rarely do this sort of thing. While there, I met an individual who wanted to pretend that Portland was a truly diverse city, even though it has a terrible reputation among black people. This was similar to Think Bike, where people were worshiping Portland because it had bike lanes. Now, people were worshiping because of the existence of a train. I pointed out that there was a large unhoused population in Portland, and that was likely because of the inability to get living wage jobs, especially at places around the magical train station. However, I was under no impression that I would change the mind of this individual because I find that people who are excessively rigid in their understanding of the world, regardless of how, refuse to change their understanding even when presented with new information. For those who say, including you, I will concede, because believing that edgy cities are social bastions of equity is a lie. I have lived in one for most of my life, and I am not impressed. The event was everything I expected it to be, including a new council member who was whining about power lines being above ground instead of underground, and a largely moneyed group. People are property owners, and they only think about ways to make the city do more for them, which the city does because its government was designed to cater to people with property. No one said anything new, and when I tried to discuss how the cost of living made it difficult for working class individuals to get to work, or that paying for a car meant a choice between food and a car, the residents' eyes would glaze over. Designing public transportation for rich people looking for a good time is a bad idea because rich people have no concept of everything not catering to their whims. Therefore, I imagine that the next transit stops presented will have the same problems of kitschy businesses that are not open late, no shade, and expensive housing that the working class largely cannot afford. One aspect I wanted to discuss, but everyone else avoided, was permit approval. In theory, if the city does not approve of development projects, developers would be required to change their plans. Unfortunately, every single time I asked how many times the city rejected developer applications, not just with this contract, but with every other contract, I got blank stares and blinks, leading me to believe that all the projects were approved. This was troublesome for many reasons, not least of which that it made me believe that all this engagement was in bad faith because nobody was actively going to stop rich people from making Austin a playground for the wealthy. Having lived near the Oracle building in southeast Austin, I knew the consequences of letting unfettered wealth have its way in working class communities, beginning with displacement and heavy police surveillance. It seems that as long as the city constantly approved developers who built projects with astronomical rents, both residential and commercial, then there would be a repetition of the same problem I was supposedly consulting to fix. Another issue is that there was an obsession with surveys, and the general public was sick of surveys, especially for information they had already provided. At almost every meeting I went to, I emphasized that nobody wanted to fill out surveys, which had been the main method of communication. Even though I provided several anecdotal accounts that led to me doing custom reports anyway, many of the consultants and Cap Metro staff were still looking for information that could be easily dissected and quantified for computer software. Furthermore, I finally lost my temper when people insisted on including a PowerPoint presentation at every meeting. I understood that those were the tools of the white-collar world, but most people will never need to compose such a presentation, and those are the tools of power speaking to power, not the public addressing the power structure. Nobody cared what I said about that across any of my contracts. And the PowerPoints and the surveys continued until the equity transit-oriented development plan was drafted. Working nights and getting into the thick of backlog for the IRS was exhausting enough, but coming home to review policies that were centered around keeping the comfortable in place while ignoring potential side effects was emotionally exhausting. The problem I had was that I still thought that people in power cared about reaching the public, and the opposite has been true since the 2020 elections, when polished, out-of-touch elites were dispatched as a solution to societal distress. In my mind, I got to work a repetitive job to put food on the table and maintain stability, but I was also intentionally inflicting myself with additional stress for people who had no interest in anything other than maintaining their stability. Those two goals were not aligned because elites know that their strength lies in domination, not collaboration, and the longer I stayed involved in the struggle, the less I was convinced that any of it was helping. By the time the draft was complete, Project Connect was interested in very succinct, non-descriptive survey-like responses. I had planned to put together a report based on my information, but there was a template they demanded we all use. The only reason that people stayed with this project was that it was about 9 months and had considerably less responsibility than ATX walk bike roll. However, the template was very short and I had no more energy to put together complicated information when all I wanted to do was sleep through every day. At the end, I submitted my survey and counted it all joy that I was basically done with the contract because all of the refusal to validate our efforts was making me numb. I had one final push with Project Connect in January and February when I went out to survey businesses and attended a number of other meetings. The only reason I was able to do it was because one of the other consultants promised that I would make it to work on time, and I was very familiar with the areas around both of the stops on South Congress and North Lamar, having lived in both areas. Businesses were even less interested in providing their opinions because they had already managed the effects of a lack of public infrastructure, bathrooms, water, shade, seating, and all they foresaw was more harassment. In fact, some of them had been very active in city meetings, explaining exactly why they were disinterested in the newer displacing developments, and the city had claimed to respect their opinions, but done what it wanted to do anyway. After all, most of the time, the city forgot that community engagement was about listening, not dictating terms to constituents who are supposed to feel represented. Doing community engagement walks before working at night and waking up to review policy was not ideal for someone in the best of health, and it completely wore me out, but thankfully, after most of the projects were complete. Project Connect was one of two contracts I was working in addition to working full time, and I had done all the in person engagement on site. The only things left were a meeting at the beginning of March, and that was fairly straightforward when it happened, especially since most of the businesses just saw the new transit model as a rise in rent. The consultant tried to make Project Connect sound exciting, but all I could hear was the echo of Think Bike, where everyone was proud of themselves for riding a train in this case. By the middle of March, Project Connect halted the community engagement, and there was nothing left for me to do but finish one more engagement contract, which would turn out to be the most authentic Austin experience of them all. The most stressful aspect of paid advocacy is that most people are paid more than the advocates, and society is trained to think nothing of people making less than they are. Already we are marginalized, which makes people view it as a favor to speak to us in a tone that resembles the control they feel entitled to have over us. Considering the pay, we are going against people making 10 times our total fee per contract, sometimes 20 times. This is not unlike the $300 million in anti-displacement money already allotted during a council meeting in March 2021 versus $7 billion for the light rail expansion itself, which was already increased. Advocates are a joke to politicians and money businesses because they can either put us in jail or charge us out of being nuisances. Nobody in power or adjacent to power considers our efforts with any seriousness.